In the vast, silent embrace of the Sierra Nevada mountains, a couple embarked on a journey that was meant to be the start of their new life, a final romantic adventure before the arrival of their first child. Instead, it became a cold case that would baffle law enforcement for over a decade. A husband and his pregnant wife vanished without a trace, leaving behind a single, smiling photo. For 11 years, their families held on to a flicker of hope, while investigators chased dead-end theories. Then, a solitary hiker stumbled upon something horrifying, a discovery that would resurrect the coldest of cases and send a team of detectives back to evidence they had overlooked for years. This is the story of a perfect crime, and the two detectives who refused to let it stay buried. Stay with us to the very end to uncover the truth and learn how this tragic mystery was finally solved. And let us know in the comments below what city you are watching this video from. The last message from the mountains arrived not with a call, but with the sterile ping of a satellite device connecting to a network miles above the Earth. For Chloe, her sister Jenna Dinger was still reachable. Jenna, 7 months pregnant and full of life, had sent a photo that was pure joy. In the image, Jenna was radiant in a blue sweater, her round belly a testament to the new life she was carrying. She sat in front of a lime green tent, while behind her, her husband Marcus knelt with a protective arm around her, a wide, happy grin splitting his bearded face. The photo was a perfect snapshot of their excitement, a final adventure before their world was forever changed. A text followed moments later, a simple message that read, "All set up for the night. The desert is beautiful. Love you." Chloe replied instantly, sending heart emojis and a reminder for Jenna to stay hydrated. She went to bed that night picturing the couple under a canopy of brilliant desert stars. That was yesterday. Now the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across her living room floor, and the silence from Joshua Tree had grown from peaceful to deeply unsettling. Jenna was supposed to call by noon, a simple plan born of Chloe's sisterly worrying. It was a concession to Chloe's anxiety about her heavily pregnant sister sleeping on the ground, even with the comfortable backup of their new camper van parked nearby. But noon had come and gone. At first, Chloe rationalized it away. Maybe they slept in. Maybe they went for a short hike and lost track of time. Their satellite phone device was new, perhaps it was finicky. But as 1 o'clock became 3 and 3 bled into 5, the rationalizations wore thin, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She called Jenna's phone. It went straight to voicemail. She called Marcus, the same result. The image on her phone, once a source of joy, now looked like a ghost. The smile seemed frozen, the desert landscape behind them vast and menacing. The camper van, a symbol of safety and preparedness, was just a silent white box in the background. Every detail that had been reassuring yesterday was now a source of terror. By sunset, the knot of fear in her stomach was too tight to ignore. Her hands trembling slightly, she looked up the non-emergency number for the National Park Service dispatch at Joshua Tree and made the call. 2 park rangers were dispatched as the last light of day faded from the sky, their headlights cutting a lonely path into the immense darkness of the park. They knew the general area the Dingers favored, a semi-secluded spot away from the main campgrounds. It took them nearly an hour of driving on paved roads and then graded dirt tracks before they saw it. Bathed in the stark white of their vehicle's searchlight, the scene looked exactly like the photo Chloe had sent. The white camper van was parked on a level patch of ground, and about 30 feet away, the lime green tent stood taut against the gentle night breeze. It was a perfect, peaceful tableau. As the rangers approached on foot, their boots crunching on the gravelly sand. The silence was absolute. There was no flicker of a campfire, no murmur of conversation. One of the rangers called out, "Mr. Dinger, Mrs. Dinger." But his voice was swallowed by the immense space. The only reply was the whisper of the wind through the creosote bushes. They circled the campsite. 2 camp chairs were angled toward a cold, unused fire pit. The tent flap was zipped shut, and a quick look inside with a flashlight revealed 2 empty sleeping bags neatly laid out. They tried the doors of the camper van. Locked. Everything was in its place, tidy and expectant, as if the occupants had simply evaporated into the dry desert air. With the first light of dawn, the campsite transformed from a place of eerie silence into a full-blown crime scene. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, a stark artificial boundary against the natural landscape of twisted trees and ancient rock. The initial park rangers had given way to county sheriff's deputies and a team of investigators. Their first priority was gaining access to the locked camper van, which sat like a sealed metal tomb in the center of the unfolding drama. Rather than break a window, they called in a locksmith, a decision rooted in the hope of preserving every shred of potential evidence. As the locksmith worked, the lead detective, a man hardened by years of investigating crimes in these vast empty spaces, surveyed the scene. In his experience, when people went missing in the wilderness, their campsites were often a mess, a sign of a hasty departure, a medical emergency, or an animal attack. This was different. This was sterile. The click of the van's lock breaking the morning silence was jarring. The side door slid open with a smooth metallic sigh, revealing the interior. The investigators peered inside, and the mystery only intensified. The sun rose higher, its light illuminating a chaotic scene of law enforcement personnel swarming over the silent campsite. A crime scene specialist meticulously dusted the camper van's handles, but the pristine nature of the site was a major obstacle. There were no signs of a struggle, no scuffs in the dirt, no spilled items. The van's interior was just as baffling. The beds were made, the small kitchen area was spotless, and their personal effects were all there. A travel bag with clothes, a toiletry kit, even a half-eaten bag of trail mix on the tiny dinette table. It was as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The search expanded rapidly. A command post was established at the entrance to the park, a hub of activity with radios crackling and maps spread out over folding tables. The initial focus was a 5-mile radius around the campsite, an area of vast, rugged wilderness. Search and rescue teams on foot began a grid-by-grid sweep, their bright orange vests a vibrant contrast against the muted browns and greens of the landscape. They were looking for anything out of place, a dropped water bottle, a piece of clothing, a footprint that didn't belong to an animal. Meanwhile, in the air, the search was even more intense. A helicopter from the California Highway Patrol, equipped with thermal imaging cameras, made slow, deliberate passes over the jagged terrain. The pilot and a spotter scanned the ground for any sign of a human heat signature. Below them, a small army of drones, piloted by trained technicians, methodically captured high-resolution images of every crevice and wash. The technology was state-of-the-art, but the landscape itself was an uncooperative adversary. The ground was littered with thousands of boulders and deep, narrow ravines that could easily conceal a person, living or otherwise. For 3 days, the search continued without a single concrete lead. The teams on the ground found nothing. The drones and helicopter reported only more rocks and more empty desert. The optimism of the first day began to wane, replaced by the grim determination that comes with a search for survivors in an unforgiving environment. Then, on the 4th day, A breakthrough, however small, finally came. A search team following a dry stream bed several miles from the campsite made a discovery. Embedded in the silt and partially submerged in a small, shallow pool of water left over from a recent rain was a smartphone. Its screen was cracked and its casing waterlogged, but a faint logo on the back confirmed it was a brand of phone used by Marcus Dinger. The phone was carefully collected and rushed to a forensics lab, a beacon of hope in the deepening gloom. It was the only item of personal property they had found outside the campsite, the sole clue to a 9-year-old disappearance. The initial frantic search for Jake and Aaron had devolved into a grim, methodical routine. The waterlogged smartphone, carefully salvaged from the creek, was a dead end. Forensic technicians had worked tirelessly to recover data, but the device's circuitry was too damaged, its secrets lost to the desert silt. The search radius around the original campsite had expanded dramatically, now encompassing dozens of square miles of unforgiving wilderness. Yet the result remained the same: emptiness. The leads were drying up, and the hope of finding the couple alive was fading with each passing hour. Then, a patrol officer on routine duty made a discovery that would re-energize the investigation, while simultaneously plunging it into a deeper state of confusion. While checking a remote parking area for a lesser-used trailhead on the far eastern side of the park, a full 30 miles from where the camper van and tent had been found, he saw it. A dark blue sedan parked neatly in a gravel lot with no other cars around. The license plate check confirmed the vehicle belonged to Jake. The discovery was a profound shock. The prevailing theory had been that the couple had driven to their remote campsite in their camper van, leaving their other vehicle behind. The presence of the sedan at a completely different and unexpected location upended every assumption the investigators had made. It meant the couple had not arrived in one vehicle and set up camp. They had used two. But why? This new information blew a gaping hole in their timeline and completely shifted the focus of the investigation. The crime scene team was once again summoned to a remote location in the middle of nowhere, approaching the car with the same sterile precision as they had the camper van. They took photographs from every angle, documenting the vehicle as it sat there, silent and undisturbed. There were no signs of a break-in, no broken windows, no scratches on the paint. The interior, visible through the tinted glass, appeared just as tidy as the camper van had been. A pair of sunglasses sat on the dashboard. A crumpled map of the area lay in the passenger seat. There was no sign of the couple, no discarded gear, no backpack, nothing to suggest a recent departure on foot. Using the spare key provided by Aaron's family, the investigators opened the car. Inside, the details were unsettling in their normalcy. The back seat was empty. The trunk contained nothing but a spare tire and a jack. The glove compartment held the car's manual and registration papers. It was a perfectly normal, functional car, as if it had been left there by someone who planned to return within the hour. The car's odometer reading was checked. The last recorded mileage was from 4 days earlier, a period that coincided with their disappearance. But the mileage had not moved since. This fact alone was baffling. It meant the car had been parked there for the better part of a week, long before the alarm was even raised. The car held no answers. It only provided more questions, each one more perplexing than the last. The investigation, which had been narrowing in on a confined search area, was now blown wide open again. It seemed Jake and Aaron's last known whereabouts were not at the campsite at all, but somewhere along the dozens of miles of desolate roads between the two locations. 9 years passed. The initial frenzy of the investigation faded into the dusty annals of the county sheriff's department. becoming little more than a stack of binders in a file cabinet marked cold cases. The immense search for Jake and Aaron had officially been suspended after 6 months of fruitless effort. The case, a tantalizing mystery of 2 vehicles and 2 abandoned campsites, had simply run out of steam, swallowed by the vast, unyielding wilderness that had become its backdrop. The family held out hope for a time, organizing their own private searches, but eventually, even they had to accept the silence. The desert, however, keeps its own secrets. It gives them up when it's ready, often by accident and without warning. It was a crisp Saturday morning when a lone hiker, a geology student meticulously cataloging rock formations, ventured off the main trail. He was looking for a specific type of quartz he had seen mentioned in an old field guide. He scrambled down a steep, rocky ravine, a place so remote and impassable that it was unlikely to have been traversed by anyone in years, let alone a large search party. The student, focused on the ground, noticed a small, unnatural pile of stones at the base of a particularly large boulder. It looked like a cairn, a man-made marker, but it was clumsily constructed, the rocks piled without purpose. Curiosity getting the better of him, he began to carefully pull away the stones, one by one. He found it almost immediately, not a rare mineral, but a glimpse of something white peeking out from beneath the rocks. The discovery was not a pristine skeleton, but rather a partial one, still clad in the remnants of a blue sweater, the fabric sun-bleached and frayed. The state of the body, protected from the elements by its rocky tomb, had preserved enough to tell a story of its own. It was a woman, and the position of her remains, the way they were tucked into the small depression in the ground, suggested she had been placed there, not fallen. There was an eerie, unsettling stillness to the scene. The student, his scientific curiosity instantly replaced by a wave of shock and revulsion, backed away from the pile of stones, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his cell phone. He was too far from a cell tower to get a signal, but a satellite beacon, a safety measure he carried for just such an emergency, would send a message to the authorities. With a click of a button, 9 years of silence were broken. The news broke the following day, a small yet powerful ripple through the quiet suburban town the couple had called home. Forensic dentists confirmed the identity through dental records. The remains belonged to Aaron Dinger. A forensic anthropologist, carefully examining the delicate bones of her pelvis, gave the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Aaron had been 7 months pregnant at the time of her death. The cause of death was not immediately clear, but the manner in which the body had been hidden suggested a foul play. The cold case was no longer cold. The silent, empty desert had finally given up its ghost, and a new investigation, 9 years in the making, was about to begin. The discovery of Aaron Dinger's remains 9 years after her disappearance was a seismic event in the quiet town. The case, once a forgotten footnote, was now front-page news. A new lead detective, a younger woman named Detective Hayes, was assigned the file. She approached the case not with the weary exhaustion of those who had worked it before, but with fresh eyes and the benefit of hindsight. The first item on her agenda was to revisit the Dinger family, not just to offer condolences, but to see if anything had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The Dingers, though devastated by the finality of the news, were also desperate for answers. They welcomed Detective Hayes, and for hours they went through old photos, letters, and documents, hoping to find a clue that the original investigators had missed. The search of the family's home was methodical. Detective Hayes, accompanied by a seasoned veteran from the cold case unit, pored over every detail. The search yielded little new information until they reached Aaron's old room. It had been left untouched for 9 years, a time capsule of a life abruptly ended. On a high shelf in her closet, tucked behind a collection of yearbooks, they found a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary. The cover was worn and slightly faded, but the pages inside were full of Erin's elegant handwriting. It had not been among the items initially collected by the first investigators. The family, consumed by grief, had forgotten about it. The contents of the diary were both heartbreaking and revelatory. They provided a window into Erin's final weeks, a perspective that had been missing for almost a decade. The early entries were full of the joy and anticipation of motherhood, her excitement palpable on the page. But as the date of the planned trip approached, the tone shifted. A subtle unease began to creep into her words. She wrote about her growing reluctance to go on the hike. She described her physical discomfort, the nausea and fatigue that made the prospect of a rugged camping trip in the mountains less of an adventure and more of a chore. She expressed her frustration with Marcus, who she felt was not listening to her concerns. The tone darkened further. Erin began to write about her suspicions. She noted Marcus's strange behavior, his long, secretive phone calls, and his withdrawn demeanor. He was distracted, not the same loving, attentive partner she knew. She wrote of an argument they had, not about the trip, but about something else entirely. Something Marcus was unwilling to discuss. He insisted the trip was important, that it was a celebration of their last days as a couple before they became a family of 3. But Erin's intuition, sharpened by the protective instincts of impending motherhood, told her something was wrong. She wrote a final, chilling entry a day before they left for the mountains. She described a sense of dread, a premonition that this trip was not what Marcus claimed it to be. She was starting to believe he was hiding something big, something that terrified her more than the mountains ever could. The diary entry ended abruptly, its final words a haunting testament to her fear. The revelations from Erin's diary had breathed new life into the cold case, but they also pointed to a chilling possibility. Marcus Dinger might not have been a victim, but a suspect. Detective Hayes and her team, now with a new perspective, returned to the evidence from the original investigation. The evidence lockers, a tomb for the Dinger case for nearly a decade, were unlocked. They pulled out the meticulously catalogued boxes of items recovered from both the camper van and the sedan. The sheer volume of material was daunting, but the team's focus was now sharper, guided by Erin's distant voice from the past. They were no longer looking for clues to a disappearance, but for evidence of a conspiracy. The camper van's contents had already been picked clean. However, the items from the sedan, found on the far side of the park, held new promise. The initial investigators had only briefly processed the car, assuming it was a simple transportation vehicle left behind. Detective Hayes' team, however, knew better. The car was not just a car. It was a part of the mystery. Among the items from the trunk, a small, unremarkable duffel bag belonging to Marcus had been overlooked. It had been stored as a collection of personal effects, and its contents were only superficially examined 9 years ago. Inside the duffel bag, beneath a folded sweatshirt and a couple of energy bars, they found it. A small, torn piece of paper. It was not a formal note, but a quick, hurried scrawl. The handwriting was clearly Marcus's. It was a cryptic message, a fragment of a larger plan. It simply read, "Meet me at the North Ridge, 7 a.m. The Lodge Trail." There was no name, no context, just the location and time. The note confirmed what Erin's diary had only hinted at. The trip to the mountains was not just a vacation. It was a rendezvous. The name Lodge was not on any of the popular trail maps, A deeper dive into historical park records revealed an old, disused hunter's trail that led to a collapsed stone structure, once known as the Hunter's Lodge. This was their meeting spot, a place so remote and forgotten that it would have been the perfect location for a secret meeting. The next logical step was to identify who Marcus was meeting. The team went back to the financial records and phone logs from the time of the disappearance. They cross-referenced his contacts, looking for anyone with a known connection to the area. A name surfaced: Paul Garrett. Garrett was Marcus's old business partner and a former close friend, and their relationship had ended bitterly 6 months before the disappearance. Paul, an avid hiker and rock climber, was also a regular visitor to the very part of the park where Marcus's sedan was found. The motive for the falling out was murky, but the connection was undeniable. The police now had a new suspect, a man with a motive and a location, a man who, 9 years ago, had been a person of interest in a completely different kind of case, one of corporate theft, not murder. The investigation, for the first time in a decade, had a face. With a name and a possible motive, Detective Hayes' team wasted no time. Paul Garrett, who now lived in a quiet suburban community 3 hours away, was brought in for questioning. He arrived at the police station looking tired but cooperative. He was a successful engineer, well-dressed and seemingly respectable. A stark contrast to the grim surroundings of the interrogation room. The detectives laid out their case, not revealing the full extent of their evidence, but enough to let him know they were no longer looking at the case as a simple disappearance. They mentioned the discovery of Aaron's body, the camper van, the sedan, and the note found in the duffel bag. Paul's composure cracked almost immediately. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his face a mask of shock and distress. He confessed to the feud with Marcus, but his version of the story painted a different picture than the one the detectives had initially formed. It wasn't a rivalry over money or a secret project. It was a deeply personal falling out. He admitted they had a business disagreement, but the heart of their conflict was about a misunderstanding that had destroyed their friendship. He described Marcus as becoming withdrawn and secretive in the months leading up to the trip. The arguments had grown more frequent, their professional partnership dissolving into a tense silence. Then Paul confessed to the rendezvous. He explained that Marcus had called him, a tearful, desperate call a day before the trip, begging to meet in the mountains to talk things through. He didn't say why he chose the remote Hunter's Lodge trail, but he insisted the meeting was urgent. Paul, still reeling from the end of their friendship, agreed, seeing it as a chance for reconciliation. He drove to the park, hiked to the designated spot, and waited. He described his frustration as he waited for hours, the sun rising higher, the desert growing hot, with no sign of Marcus. He was confused, angry, and finally, worried. After waiting for over 5 hours, he hiked back to his car and drove home, furious at his old friend for what he believed was a cruel, last-minute prank. The detectives pressed him on the details, but his story was consistent. He hadn't seen Marcus. He hadn't seen Aaron. He hadn't been anywhere near the campsite where the tent was found. His timeline was plausible, and his emotional state seemed genuine. He expressed profound shock and sadness at the news of Aaron's death. The detectives, in that moment, realized their primary suspect might not be the killer after all, but rather another piece in the puzzle, another victim of a betrayal he had yet to fully comprehend. They had to pivot again. Paul Garrett's tearful testimony had thrown the investigation into a new kind of chaos. If he wasn't the killer, then who was? The detectives were left with a deeper, more complicated mystery. They went back to the original source of the quarrel between Marcus and Paul, not as a motive for murder, but as a window into the professional and emotional life of the missing man. The animosity between the two friends, it turned out, ran far deeper than Paul had let on. It was a tangled web of ambition, paranoia, and a groundbreaking project that threatened to tear their lives apart. Marcus and Paul had been more than friends. They had been partners in a small, ambitious tech startup specializing in predictive analytics software. Their company was on the verge of a major breakthrough, a new algorithm that could analyze vast amounts of data to predict consumer behavior with uncanny accuracy. It was Marcus's brainchild, a project he had poured years of his life into. Paul, as the business development lead, was tasked with securing funding and finding a buyer for the technology. The project was a potential game changer, and the stakes were astronomical. According to company records and old employee interviews, Marcus had grown increasingly secretive and protective of his work in the months leading up to the trip. He had installed encryption software on his computer and started working late, often after Paul and the rest of the team had gone home. He began to confide in a few trusted colleagues, expressing his paranoia that someone was trying to steal his code. The suspicion, he told them, fell squarely on Paul. He believed Paul was having secret meetings with a rival company, an accusation Paul had vehemently denied. The argument had escalated from a professional disagreement to a fiery, personal betrayal. Marcus had eventually cut Paul out of the project entirely, sending the company into a state of flux and destroying their friendship. The detectives now understood the depth of the betrayal. Marcus wasn't just a man on a trip. He was a man on the run, or at least a man trying to protect something immensely valuable. The note he had left for Paul wasn't a call for reconciliation. It was a setup. Marcus likely believed Paul was the one behind the attempt to steal his project, and the remote meeting place was a calculated move, a way to confront him away from prying eyes. The motive for Aaron's death, however, remained a mystery. Why would Marcus, a man so protective of his pregnant wife, risk bringing her into such a dangerous situation? The police now had a theory, not of a murder, but of a kidnapping, with Aaron as a pawn in a high-stakes corporate game gone horribly wrong. They began to suspect that Marcus and Aaron had met with Paul, but that the meeting had gone tragically awry, leaving Paul as a possible witness, or even worse, an accomplice. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but one crucial element was still missing: the secret project itself. The police had a motive, a suspect, and a timeline, but they were missing the key to the entire conspiracy. They knew Marcus's code was at the heart of the conflict with Paul, and they knew it was important enough to risk everything for. But where was it? The initial searches of the camper van and the sedan had turned up nothing. The computers and tablets in both vehicles had been wiped clean, as if in a deliberate attempt to erase any digital footprint. It was a dead end. Detective Hayes, however, was a persistent investigator. She didn't believe a man as meticulous and paranoid as Marcus would simply leave his life's work to chance. He would have had a backup, a contingency plan. The team went back to the sedan for a third time, not to search for what they had already found, but to search for what they had missed. This time, they brought in a forensic mechanic, a specialist who could dismantle the vehicle piece by piece, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The search was long and tedious. The mechanic began with the dashboard, then moved to the seats, the door panels, and the trunk lining. He found nothing. They were about to give up when the mechanic, on a whim, decided to check a seemingly innocuous spot: the underside of the car's console, where the shifter and cup holders were located. He removed the plastic casing, revealing the car's electrical wiring and a tangle of cables. Wedged deep inside the console, secured with a piece of electrical tape, was a small, unremarkable USB flash drive. It was so small, so well hidden, that it would have been impossible to find without completely dismantling the car. The drive was rushed to the lab. A team of digital forensics experts worked for hours, bypassing the security and encryption. The contents of the drive were a goldmine. It was the complete code for Marcus's predictive analytics project. But it was not a simple backup. The drive also contained a series of encrypted text files, letters from Marcus to his wife, Erin, and to a lawyer. In the letters, Marcus detailed his fears. He explained that Paul had been trying to steal the code 4 months, and that he had been forced to take drastic measures to protect his work and his family. He had planned to meet Paul in the mountains to hand over a decoy version of the code, a flawed version that would have been worthless. His plan was to expose Paul's treachery, and then go into hiding with Erin until the legal battle was over. The decoy code was on a separate flash drive. The final and most devastating piece of information was a video file recorded a few days before the trip. In the video, Marcus was standing in the garage, a small box in his hand. He was talking to the camera, his voice full of fear and exhaustion. "I'm leaving this here," he said, "just in case something happens to me. The real code is hidden in the car. The decoy is in the camper van. I don't trust Paul. I don't trust anyone. I just want to protect my family." The video ended abruptly. The police now had the entire story, not of a disappearance, but of a man driven to the edge, a man who had planned to go into hiding, but whose plan had gone terribly, tragically wrong. The discovery of the hidden flash drive and the chilling video had fundamentally altered the investigation. Jake Dinger was no longer just a missing person. He was a key figure in a desperate plan, a man who had anticipated treachery and tried to outwit it. Detective Hayes, her office now a chaotic maze of binders and digital files, felt the case's final puzzle pieces beginning to click into place. The narrative of a couple lost to the mountains or of a tragic sudden death was falling apart. A new, more complex story was emerging, one of a man who had not disappeared but had gone into hiding. The evidence now pointed to a calculated, albeit flawed, plan. Jake had created 2 versions of his precious code, one a decoy to be given to his friend, and the other, the real one, hidden away for safekeeping. The meeting with Paul Garrett at the old hunter's lodge was not a chance for reconciliation, but a trap. Jake had intended to expose his former friend, to reveal his deceit in a remote location, far from the company and the legal battles that would surely follow. He had likely intended to hand over the decoy flash drive, feigning a truce, while his wife, Erin, waited safely nearby. But something had gone wrong. The video file had been recorded just before the trip, but the last communication from the couple, the cheerful text and photo, had been sent from the campsite. The timing was off. Detective Hayes pored over the timeline, her fingers tracing the events on a large whiteboard. Jake and Erin had left their home, driven to the mountains and set up camp. Sometime after that, Jake had driven the sedan, with the real flash drive and his duffel bag, to the remote trailhead. He had left it there and returned to the campsite. The note found in the duffel bag had been his reminder, his blueprint for the confrontation with Paul. He had parked the car as a contingency, a getaway vehicle for when the meeting went sideways. But why had the car been found so far away from the initial campsite? And why was Erin's body found in a completely different location, also miles from the confrontation site? The puzzle pieces were there, but the sequence was out of order. It was as if Jake had set up 2 separate scenarios. Detective Hayes began to form a new theory, a chilling one that put Jake not in the victims column, but in the survivors. What if the meeting with Paul had gone exactly as Jake had planned, but with a horrifying twist? What if, after confronting Paul, Jake discovered that a third party was involved, a more powerful and dangerous adversary? What if he realized that not only was his project at risk, but his life and his family were in mortal danger? The sterile, abandoned camper van, the neat and tidy tent, they were not a sign of a sudden departure. They were a sign of a cover-up. Jake hadn't disappeared. He had escaped. He had vanished into the immense, unforgiving wilderness, not as a victim, but as a man on the run, a man who had lost his wife, but had managed to keep a hold of his greatest asset. He was out there somewhere, a ghost in the vast, empty spaces of the American West. Detective Hayes's theory, a bold and speculative one, had no official support. Her superiors believed the case was a tragedy, a double homicide at the hands of Paul Garrett, and they were ready to move forward with the arrest. But Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that they were wrong. Paul's story, though self-serving, had an emotional authenticity that didn't fit with the cold-blooded murder of a pregnant woman. The abandoned sedan, the perfectly clean campsite, the hidden flash drive, all of it pointed to a deeper, more complicated narrative. She needed to find Jake. She had a strong belief that he hadn't died, but had gone into a self-imposed exile, hiding from a threat that was far bigger than they had initially imagined. She spent days poring over old satellite images of the park, comparing them with the modern ones. She wasn't looking for signs of a new structure or a person. She was looking for a ghost. She finally found it in a remote, forgotten corner of the park, far from any established trail or road. It was a cluster of stone walls, the remnants of an old miners' camp that had been abandoned a century ago. The camp was a perfect hiding spot, a place where a person could disappear and live off the grid for years without being disturbed. A man with survivalist skills and a deep knowledge of the park, a man like Jake, would have known about such a place. She packed a small bag with water, food, and a handgun and set off alone. She knew it was a dangerous and reckless move, but she also knew it was her only chance. The hike was brutal, a grueling 11-hour trek over jagged rocks and through dense underbrush. She reached the camp as the sun was setting, its last light casting long, mournful shadows over the crumbling stone walls. The camp was just as the satellite images had shown it, a collection of ruins, a silent testament to a forgotten past. She called out, "Jake, it's Detective Hayes. I know who you are. I know what happened to Aaron." The silence was deafening, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the hope out of her lungs. She was about to turn back to admit defeat when a voice, dry and raspy from disuse, called out from behind one of the ruins, "How did you find me?" He was a ghost of a man. His hair was long and matted, his beard an unkempt tangle. His face was gaunt, his eyes haunted and full of a profound sadness. But it was Jake. She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not a missing person, but a man in mourning. He sat her down by a small, dying fire and began to talk. His voice was a monotone, a man telling a story he had relived 1,000,000 times in his head. He confirmed her suspicions. The trip had been a trap for Paul. He had planned to meet him at the hunter's lodge, to expose his deceit and hand over a decoy flash drive, which he had left in the camper van. Aaron, he said, had been waiting at a different location, a safe distance away. But when he got to the lodge, it wasn't Paul who was waiting. It was Paul's business associate, a ruthless corporate raider named Alan Chambers, a man Marcus had been trying to outmaneuver for years. Chambers hadn't come for the code. He had come for Jake, He told Jake he knew about the real code, the one in the sedan. He told him he knew about Aaron. He then made Jake an offer. Hand over the code, and he and Aaron would be set free. If not, she would pay the price. Jake had no choice. He agreed to lead Chambers to the sedan. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he had to protect Aaron. He was hoping to create an opportunity to escape, but it was all for nothing. He led Chambers to Aaron's location first, hoping to convince her to run while he dealt with Chambers. He found her already dead, a single bullet wound to the chest. Chambers had found her first. Paul, Jake explained, had not been a conspirator, but a pawn, an unwilling accomplice who had been coerced into revealing Jake's plan. Chambers had lied, telling Jake that Paul had killed Aaron, a cruel and calculated act designed to turn the two friends against each other and erase the trail. He then explained why he had run. He knew Chambers would never let him live. He also knew Chambers would never find the real flash drive. He ran, not to save himself, but to protect his project, his life's work, a legacy for his unborn child. He had been living in the abandoned camp for 9 years, a man without a name, a ghost, a witness to a murder that no one believed. He had lived off the land, surviving on a diet of wild game and berries, a solitary existence with only the ghosts of his past for company. He had been waiting for the day when someone would finally come looking for him, waiting for the chance to tell his story. He then handed Hayes a small, tattered map, a map he had made himself. On it were a series of markings, a complex series of caves and ravines, leading to a specific location in the mountains. "This is where he hid it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The gun. He hid the gun that killed Aaron. Paul told me about it." The final piece of the puzzle, a motive and a murder weapon, was finally within their grasp. The cold wind that whipped through the ruins of the old miners' camp was a stark contrast to the quiet desperation in Jake Dinger's voice. His confession, a haunting tale of corporate sabotage and a brutal murder, was the final piece of the puzzle Detective Hayes needed. She sat in silence for a long time after he finished, watching the last embers of his small fire glow in the deepening darkness. Jake was a broken man, a survivor of a tragedy that had taken everything from him. The man who had been a ghost for 9 years was finally ready to return to the world, not as a victim, but as a witness. The return to civilization was a jarring experience for Jake. He was thin and frail, his eyes unaccustomed to the bright lights of the city. He was taken to a local hospital for a physical and mental evaluation, a necessity before he could face the legal world that awaited him. He was no longer a missing person, but a protected witness, a man with a story that could bring down a powerful and ruthless corporate raider. Meanwhile, back at the station, Detective Hayes and her team acted on Jake's information. The map he had drawn led them to a series of deep, narrow caves in a remote part of the park. The search was difficult and dangerous, but they found it exactly where Jake said it would be. A small, weathered leather pouch tucked into a crevice, hidden from the elements and from prying eyes. Inside the pouch was a handgun, its serial number still legible. Ballistics confirmed it was the weapon that had been used to kill Aaron Dinger 9 years ago. The discovery, combined with Jake's testimony and the evidence from the hidden flash drive, gave them everything they needed. A warrant was issued for Alan Chambers' arrest. He was a man of power and influence, but even he could not escape the weight of the evidence against him. He was arrested at his home, a sprawling mansion in the suburbs, and taken into custody without a struggle. The media frenzy that followed was immense. The story of a missing husband who had been living in hiding to protect his life's work, and the wife who had paid the ultimate price, captivated the nation. But for Jake, the final chapter was not about justice or revenge. It was about closure. He sat in a small room, a cup of coffee growing cold on the table in front of him, waiting. The door opened and Aaron's parents walked in. For a moment, there was only silence, a chasm of grief and unspoken words. Aaron's mother, a woman who had spent 9 years mourning a daughter and a son-in-law, looked at him with a mixture of hope and sorrow. Jake, his eyes welling up with tears, stood up and walked towards them. He didn't know what to say, how to explain 9 years of silence. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save her." Aaron's mother, tears streaming down her face, walked over to him and embraced him, a hug that was both an offering of forgiveness and a desperate plea for healing. The story was over, but the memories would live on. Jake's testimony, combined with the forensic evidence, led to Chambers's conviction. Paul Garrett, it was revealed, had not been a murderer, but a pawn, a man who had made a mistake and had to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. He was dead now, but his complicity in the tragedy was a final, bitter lesson in the cost of ambition and misplaced trust. Jake Dinger, the man who had disappeared into the mountains, was finally free. He had lost everything, but he had found his voice. He had told his story, and in doing so, he had found a path to redemption, a path that led back to the family he had left behind, a family that against all odds was still willing to forgive him.